Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing the CSS position property and everything it does to determine how an element is positioned in the document. So here's an example. We have a HTML file with a paragraph. This is I am a paragraph. This is the blue paragraph at the top of the output. And then we have this section. The section contains a div with the ID of box, and this is the green box we see. And then this very long paragraph, and it has the ID of long. And now let's go over to the CSS and see everything happening here. So first on the paragraphs, we're just setting some styling to make everything a little bit easier to see, making the font sizes bigger, adding some margin and padding, as well as the 2-pixel black borders. And then this selector here is the selector for the first paragraph because it's the only one directly nested within the body. We set its background to light blue. Here we have the box, so this is that light green box. We set its width and height as well as we gave it a border. And then the long paragraph, we gave a light yellow background. By default, we say all of the elements on the page are what we call static positioned. And this is just the positioning that we've been used to. So if I go to this website and I scroll, we'll see everything scrolls sort of how we would expect it to. But we can change the way this works by using the position property. So let's go to our box and we will add position, and let's start with fixed. So what fixed says is that this is going to be completely removed from the normal flow of the document. So you'll see this pushes it on top of other items. So now it is covering up our long paragraph. And then we can use the top property to move the box. So top 10 pixels, we'll set it 10 pixels from the top of the browser window. And now when I scroll, you'll see the box stays there because it is fixed to the viewport. So no matter what I do, this box will always be 10 pixels from the top of my browser window. We can also use the left property, so maybe I want it to go 200 pixels away from the left, save that, and now it's more towards the center, and it will just stay here. There's also a bottom and a right property that do very similar things, so I can maybe change this to bottom, and you see now the box is stuck at the bottom of the page. So as I scroll, that box will just stay there at the bottom. As a word of warning, I would usually avoid position fixed, the reason being it can cover up other items on the page, which is obviously a bad user experience. That said, there can occasionally be good use cases for position fixed, so it's good to know that we have this option. Next, let's take a look at position relative. So position relative is fairly simple. It sticks the element where it normally would have been, and then it uses the bottom and left or the top and right properties to add an offset based on that natural position. So for example, here, if I comment these out, you'll see this is its normal position. And then when we add these back in, it goes 10 pixels up from the bottom and 200 pixels over from the left. Same thing if we use, say, top of 20 pixels, then it will be 20 pixels down from where it was originally. And we can say something like left 100 pixels, and you'll see this will move everything over from the left. It's worth noting you can also use negative values here, so this will move it over towards the left. But most of the time, if you wanted to do this, you would actually just want to use right and then the other value, because this is going to usually end up doing the exact same thing. Now with position relative, it will stay where we put it. So as I scroll, it's going to scroll with the page. It's not going to be removed from the flow of the document like we saw with position fixed. And next, let's take a look at position sticky. So position sticky is sort of a mixture between position relative and position fixed. And the idea here is that when I scroll down, the element will stay where it was. So it will hit the top of 20 pixels and left of 100 pixels, and then it won't go away. It's going to stay on the page. And this is actually really great for things like navigation bars. So if I had maybe a top of 0, save this, and then when I scroll down, once it gets to the top, it's going to just stay there. So you can imagine if we had some navigation bar, we could use position sticky so that as the user scrolls, they always have access to that nav bar. But again, you do want to be careful that you are not covering up other elements on the page that you don't want to be covering up. This will act very similar to position fixed. Once you start scrolling, it essentially is a fixed element, so it is going to block other elements that are below it. So we need to be careful about that, but as long as we are, position sticky can be a great option for these navigation bars. We also do want to be cognizant of accessibility of browsers here though. Some of the older browsers didn't have support for position sticky. Most of the new and modern ones do, but if you're trying to support very old browsers, just know that position sticky might not work. And you might want to test your output on those old browsers to make sure that it is still doing something that is reasonable. Next, let's take a look at position absolute. So position absolute has sort of two purposes. Most of the time, this is going to act very similar to position fixed. The difference being that when I scroll, it's actually going to stay where it was on the page. So rather than being absolutely positioned with respect to the browser window, it is with respect to where it is on the page in the actual document. However, this isn't always the case. If the parent of a position absolute element is position relative, or rather if anything above it is a position relative, it will instead be positioned absolute to that relative item. So let me show you what I mean. If we remember, this box was inside of this section, so I can make this section position relative, and now the box will be positioned absolutely to that section. So you can see it moved down to the beginning of this section, but it still is absolutely positioned. It's still on top of the other items, and it is still following this top and left values. So it is now 0 pixels away from the top of the section, which now happens to be the top of the long paragraph, and it's 100 pixels away from the left of that section. Now, the next question you might have is, what if I want it to not be on top of these other elements? I want it to be positioned absolutely, but I want the other elements on top of it. And the way we can solve this is with what we call a z-index. So I'm going to go down to the long paragraph, and I can add a z-index property. And the z-index property allows you to say, I want this element to be at some height. So by default, everything's sort of at the 0 height at the same level. So I can change this to say it's at a z-index of 2. And when I save, you'll notice nothing actually happens. And the reason for this is related to something we call stacking contexts. We'll get more into what that means in the video on stacking contexts, but for now, just know that we need to be creating a new stacking context whenever we use z-index, and this doesn't happen by default with position static elements, and there's going to be lots of ways we can create the stacking context, but the easiest will be to set this to position relative, and again, we will go much more in depth on why we need to do this in that video, but for now, just know that usually with position static elements, we won't be able to use z-index immediately, and we'll need to change either the position or another property that will create that stacking context for us. And now you'll see the paragraph is actually on top of the box, so we can't see the box at all anymore. So what I can do is I'll add a negative 10 pixels to the top of the box just so we can see it sort of peeking out. Maybe we'll go even a little bit higher, negative 20 pixels. And you can see the box is now peeking out from behind the long paragraph. And of course, we can add z-index to more elements. So I could add a z-index to the box. And now these z-indexes are going to be competing with each other. So if I made this one 3, now the z-index of the box is greater than the z-index of the long paragraph. So the box is back on top. But of course, if I then change the long paragraph to be z-index of 4, it shows up on top again. And this can just keep on happening. And you could imagine you could have lots of different positioned elements all over the page, and you could be using different z-indexes to determine how high they are on the page. Now moving on from position and z-index, there's one more set of properties I want to look at for something called float. So let's go here and comment out these position changes we've made. So let's no longer use the position absolute or relative and go back to how we had it at the beginning. But we're going to try something called float. Now, float is very similar to position in that it does remove elements from the normal flow, but it allows us to take elements and have them sort of flow around other elements. So let me show you what I mean. Let's come over to the box, and I'm going to say float left. Save this, and you'll see now the paragraph is sort of wrapping around the box. So what float does is it just says, take this element and push it to one side of its container, in this case, the left side, and then allow the elements below it to just wrap around it wherever there's empty space on the other side. And this is a very powerful tool, especially if you're doing something like a blog post and you want to have an image in it, but you don't want the image to take up the whole width. You can float text around the image and get some very nice sort of curving of the text. And we can actually do this with multiple items. So we could change the I am a paragraph to float right. And now you'll see the text is sort of wrapping around both of them. And I am a paragraph is on the right side of it because it's floating right, whereas the box is on the left side because it is floating left. And finally, sometimes you need some of the elements not to be paying attention to float. And what I mean by this is on the long paragraph, we could add this property clear. And clear allows an element to say, actually, I want to go below whatever is floating on the left or the right. So we can say clear both. And this is going to say both the elements that floated left and right, make sure I am below them. And then we could also do something just like clear right. And what this says is go below the item that floated right. If there's something floating left still that is bigger, we can still allow it to float. And then we could also do clear left. This isn't going to look like it does anything here because the element on the left is taller than the element on the right. So to clear the left one, we also have to clear the right one. So in this case, clear left is the same as clear both. And that's going to be the end of this video on position. As a closing thought, try to use position sparingly. We don't want to be setting lots of elements to position fixed and absolute. For the most part, we want our elements staying in the normal flow of the page, but we should use position when we need to, of course. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.